So I was first interested in environmental policy in China starting in around 2004 when I lived in Beijing and then Kunming for 2 years, working on some national park policy. And since that time, I've always been interested in understanding the policies that would lead to better environmental outcomes in China because China is one of the most important, if not the most important country in the world in terms of achieving a healthy environment. They're very soon going to be the largest economy in the world. They're the largest emitter of many pollutants. And so understanding the pathways that would lead to effective environmental outcomes is an incredibly important and exciting area to work. So this particular project started from a realization that many scholars of Chinese environmental policy are thinking about what is termed the implementation gap. And so the implementation gap is the idea that there are very strong policies at the national level that deal with environmental pollutants of various kinds. If you look at the legal framework, you would think that China does an excellent job in terms of managing their environmental resources, in terms of making sure that pollution is not damaging human health. However, if you look at what's actually happening on the ground, you see that this story is very different. The story is that China is experiencing some of the worst pollution anywhere in the world. It is a major public health crisis. There are many people that are recognizing that things need to change. And the challenge has been that while the national government has established very strong policies and guidelines to manage the environment, local governments that are responsible for carrying out those policies and directives don't often do a great job at implementation. And there are a few reasons for this. Local governments might not have the resources necessary to fully implement national policies well. At the same time, local leaders and officials have to meet a variety of different targets. Some of those targets are environmental, some of those targets are economic. And so a local leader has a lot of incentives to make sure that firms in their area of jurisdiction are maximizing economic output, leading to pollution. And so these mandates to manage pollution for human health and to maximize economic output can be at odds with each other. And there are a lot of benefits to local leaders of finding ways to skirt the rules around pollution and favor the rules around economic output, at least traditionally. This has been subject of much research that has tried to understand the way that local leaders make decisions about what policies to pursue and what policies to make a second priority. And so what we wanted to understand then is whether it is possible to use public transparency about environmental management as a way to manage this implementation gap. So you have strong national policies. Those strong national policies aren't often implemented well. Is it possible to highlight the compliance or non-compliance of local leaders in meeting rules about being transparent on pollution as a way to get them to do their jobs more effectively, get them to meet national directives more effectively? So the reason why we think our research is important is that it solves, or at least attempts to understand, this critical implementation gap. That is, local leaders aren't always adhering to national policies to release information to the public about pollution. There's a lot of non-compliance in this area. Would it be possible to support the efforts of central government by having an NGO rate local governments on transparency directives in a way that would actually boost their performance. And there's a lot of interest in the scholarly community about closing the implementation gap, but there's not a lot of evidence about strategies that would work to close the implementation gap, which is really the motivation for this particular study. So we have one main hypothesis behind the study, and then a couple of hypotheses about mechanisms. The main hypothesis of the study is that when you have a national non-governmental organization rate local governments on whether they comply with rules to be transparent about pollution, that will boost the level of transparency and compliance with transparency rules by local governments. So that's the main hypothesis. We want to see if the work of our partner agency, the Institute for Public and Environmental Affairs, which has been rating local governments for many years, is actually causing any change in the behavior of local governments. And our main hypothesis is that this could potentially work, that by rating local governments, you will see increased compliance with the rules about transparency by local governments. Now, we have some sub-hypotheses that deal with mechanisms. We think there are basically two ways that rating local governments could cause a difference in their behavior around transparency. First, it might solve what is called a principal agent problem for the central government. The basic idea here is that the central government faces high costs in monitoring local governments and making sure that they comply with these rules. Being transparent about pollution requires releasing a whole bunch of information, making sure that that information is digestible to the public, releasing this information in a variety of formats. And so it is difficult to monitor the performance of local governments in actually meeting these kinds of standards. What the NGO does by providing a ranking is solve that problem for the central government. Here, if the local government makes it easier for the central government to see whether compliance is happening, then we should, in expectation, see local governments improve their performance because they will be known to be out of compliance by the central government more easily. So our first hypothesis about mechanisms is this is going to cause an effect because the monitoring problem of the central government will be solved. The second main mechanism that we have a hypothesis about is the idea that this could generate public demand. So by rating local governments on whether or not they comply with rules about pollution and being transparent about pollution, you might start a public discussion. It might make citizens more aware of problems that local governments are experiencing in meeting these kinds of standards and create a kind of bottom-up pressure for local governments to improve their practices. So as a second hypothesis about mechanisms, we're interested in studying whether or not rating local governments actually causes more citizen attention and media attention to transparency about pollution in the cities that are part of the treatment. The main method that we use to carry out this study is a randomized field experiment. So what we do is bring 50 cities into our experimental sample that have never been rated by our partner IPE. These cities are then divided randomly into two groups, a treatment group and a control group of 25 cities each. For all of the cities, all 50, our team over 3 years with IPE, our partner, forms ratings about how well they comply with national rules about releasing information on pollution. For the treatment group, 25 that are randomly assigned, we work with our partner IP to make that rating public for the 2 years of the study. So that is, there's a national news conference, there's reports that are put into the public domain. So those 25 cities are now on notice that the public and the central government has information about their compliance with these pollution rules. The control cities, we're watching and we're rating, but the rating for those cities is not being released publicly. So that means we are able to distinguish any increase in the rating, which is a measure of how much these cities are complying with the rules. We are able to attribute the difference between the treatment group and the control group to the release of the ratings publicly. So that is our basic method, is comparing the treatment group to the control group, both of which are assigned randomly. Now, one of the challenges of interpreting our study is that we are building on the previous work of our partner IPE. So they have been rating cities using this Pollution Information Transparency Index since the mid-2000s and have annually conducted ratings for approximately 120 cities. What we did for this study is add 50 new cities to that portfolio that have never been rated previously. Now, one challenge with interpreting the study, therefore, is our results are limited to understanding the impact of rating cities in a group of cities that are smaller, more mid-sized kinds of provincial level cities than the main set of cities that have already been rated for many years. Obviously, those cities aren't eligible to be part of the experimental sample because we can't have a control group from among the cities that have already been rated. So we face some challenges in thinking about how our results generalize to rating cities everywhere. So we found a pretty exciting result in this experiment, which is that when you rate cities publicly about how they are performing on transparency, that increases their level of transparency as compared to the control group. And the size of the effect is substantial. And so how we evaluate the effect is the number of points on the Pollution Information Transparency Index scale that the treatment group increased as compared to the control group. And so what we see is that on a scale of 0 to 100, that we had the treatment group increase their points approximately 7 more than the control group. Now, the control group is increasing over time as well because the central government is putting a lot of pressure on cities of all kinds to increase their compliance with rules about transparency. But the treatment group increases their score more quickly than the control group. What we see is that the increase in the treatment group, the additional increase, is about as large as the over time increase in the control group. So that means that the effect of being rated is about as large as the effect of national government pressures on local governments over time. So we think this is a pretty exciting result, and to our knowledge, the first real result that shows local governments will have better performance when they are rated by a non-governmental organization. Now, in terms of the other two hypotheses about mechanisms, we find some interesting results. On the first hypothesis about whether or not this is creating pressure from the central government and solving monitoring problems, what we see through a series of interviews is that local government officials are highly attuned to being rated out of compliance. And so it seems that the officials that are part of the treatment group have experienced increased pressure to respond to the rules about being transparent on pollution, and that they state a willingness and an interest in increasing their score on the Pollution Information Transparency Index. So we have some information from qualitative data analysis that the treatment is effective at solving the monitoring problem of the central government when they are thinking about managing local government performance. On the other hand, when we look at results on public attention to pollution and transparency about pollution, we do not see an uptick in attention by either the public or the news media. So that is, we see when we look at the posts of Chinese citizens on the platform Weibo, that the citizens are not posting more frequently about pollution in the treatment cities as compared to the control cities. Neither are they posting more frequently about transparency. And likewise, when we look at news media coverage of the cities in our sample, the news media is not reporting on pollution or transparency more often in the treatment cities than in the control cities. And so what this leads us to conclude is that that mechanism is not at work, that the rating of cities is not having an effect on the overall level of transparency because of bottom-up pressure. And this leads us to the conclusion that what's at work here is a non-governmental organization working with central government to solve their information problems, rather than a non-governmental organization that's creating a lot of pressure from citizens, news media, non-governmental organizations that will generate action from local governments.